Right. So my goal is to talk about a few computational models that I see being used regularly in practice. First, let me tell you what I'm not going to tell you. So there's no new results or fancy lower bounds or anything here. My goal is really to bring your attention to a couple of computational models that I see that work well in practice, that seem to be liked by practitioners. In the world, in the type of models that I'm going to talk about, there's quite a lot of nice upper bounds, not many lower bounds, and the gap between the upper bounds, lower bounds, and what tends to get used in practice is quite large. And I think for any one of these topics, upper bounds or lower bounds or practice, there are very smart people who can tell you lots of details about them. If you want to hear about all three of them in the same talk, you're probably stuck with me. So that's okay. So in large data analysis, there are two what I would consider milestones. One is the first one is something that most people here are very familiar with. The work of Alon Matthias Szegedy, which happened about 20 years ago. This is the frequency moments problem. For I'm assuming everyone knows what frequency moments are.
Don't assume.
Sorry?
Don't assume that.
Okay, so let's do it. So, you are given a stream of elements from some universe, and every element appears a certain number of times, called its frequency. The first the frequency moment, the kth frequency moment, says you take these frequencies, raise them to the kth power for each element, sum them over all the elements, right? So if you do it for k equals 1, obviously you get the number of elements. You add up all the frequencies raised to the power 1, you get the number of elements. Frequencies raised to 0 is an interesting one because that is considered the distinct element problems. You count how many distinct elements there are in the stream. That's a very interesting problem in its own right with a lot of practical applications as well. The most interesting, I think the surprising factor here was k equals 2, which corresponds to some very natural questions in databases about join sizes and other things. What Alon Matthias and Szegedy did was to give a surprisingly low space, one pass streaming algorithm for this problem. They gave a log m space where m is the size of the universe here. Okay. Typically, we tend to think of the size of the universe as polynomial in the length of the stream. So, these are about the same. Equally amazingly, in the same paper, they also gave a lower bound for the kth frequency moment for which applies when k is at least 6, I think. So this has since been improved. We now know pretty much the optimal bounds. I think it's 10 to the 1 minus 1 over k. The lower bounds are shown from a reduction from set disjointness, the multi-party number in hand set disjointness that we heard about earlier today. So there, Alon Matthias and Szegedy showed a polynomial lower bound. So there's a nice gap between the second and the higher frequency moments. And this paper turned out to, at least for theorists, crystallize the problem of data stream algorithms, and the whole area came about. About 10 years later, Jeff Dean and Sanjay Ghemawat, who are at Google, published this very nice paper in I think, the Operating Systems Conference, OSDI. What they introduced was a programming abstraction, right? It's not a new computational model or anything. It's really a programming abstraction. And people in databases and systems often have a criticism. They say that we've had this for 20 years or 30 years or whatever. But what Dean and Ghemawat did was to make it actually very, very easy to use. They made it a programming model that people who are not doing databases or systems could actually use. And naturally at Google, there are people who are doing web search, information retrieval, data mining, machine learning, all kinds of things. And all of these people could suddenly write very nice large data parallel programs in this abstraction. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. But what they did was really, the system took care of the parallelization, distributing it, and most importantly, fault tolerance. And because of this, it became very easy to use. Since then, of course, a bunch of theory people have started to look at, what other algorithms can we build on this model for natural and interesting computational problems. So going back to the data stream model that Alon Matthias and Szegedy popularized, here the input has n records that arrive in some order, and the algorithm is restricted in 3 ways. Number 1, you have read-once access to the stream. You only read an element and then it's gone. You never see it again. Second, your internal memory is expected to be really small. Polylog in the stream length is considered good. And finally, you would like to process each element as soon as possible. If your memory is relatively small, there's not a whole lot you could do, so polylog also makes sense there. I already talked about frequency moments. There's a bunch of other very nice algorithms, heavy hitters, or finding elements that appear unusually popularly in the stream for some definition of that. Jaikumar Radhakrishnan and Parikshit had this nice paper on finding duplicates in a data stream, which is again a surprisingly nice, almost elementary algorithm that actually works very nicely. Counting the number of inversions, in other words, you're given a stream of numbers and you want to know how many pairs of numbers are out of order with respect to each other. So for a whole bunch of these problems, there are very nice streaming algorithms. Pretty much all of them are log type, polylog complexity. The one thing that's surprisingly weak about the data stream model is that it doesn't seem very relevant to problems where the input is something beyond just a sequence of numbers, or the output is more than a sequence of numbers, right? If your input is a graph and you want to find the connected components, it seems very difficult to even think about it or reason about it in the data stream model. Matrices or linear programming problems or machine learning questions, which typically involve some type of optimization, seem not very relevant or seem hard to analyze in the data stream model, certainly for upper bounds. The data stream model also has a very natural connection to communication complexity. If you want to prove a lower bound on the data stream complexity of a problem, you typically break up the input into two or more parts and assume that multiple players have pieces of the input, and you show one round or multi-round lower bounds in the communication complexity. Essentially, if there is a good data stream algorithm, Alice or Bob or Carol could take the state of the algorithm and pass it on to the next player, have them continue the simulation, and you'll get a good communication upper bound. So a lower bound on communication complexity usually means that you get a space lower bound on any data stream algorithm. As I mentioned earlier, the memory requirement makes upper bound problems somewhat unnatural. You cannot even maintain a connected component or a minimum spanning tree or any of these things. So what typically ends up happening is even the interesting algorithms tend to compute the value of a solution, right? You want to decide if a given graph in a data stream model has a max cut of at least some value or a min cut of at least some value or any of these things, right? So you're not solving the right problem in the data stream model. Therefore, the ideas are usually very nice, but they tend not to be very applicable in practice. And similarly, for the same reason, lower bounds in this model often say something very nice about the structure of the problem, the combinatorial structure of the problem, than about our inability to solve in practice. Because when people need to solve connected components, they build something and solve connected components, right? Just because we prove a lower bound here doesn't mean that it never gets solved. So that's a weird state of affairs that this leaves us in. So let's turn to MapReduce quickly. Here the model is that the input is a bunch of key value pairs. You have lots of them. Typically, the large number of key value pairs are assumed to be split into chunks and stored on multiple machines or multiple disks or whatever. There are three primitive functions, maps, shuffle, and reduce. The map or the mapper is a memoryless function that at any one time looks at a single record, a key value pair, and it produces 0 or more intermediate key value pairs, again, possibly with different keys. And it can produce many different keys in the same invocation. The fact that the mapper is a memoryless function makes it particularly attractive because you can start a whole bunch of these mappers on a lot of different machines. Each machine processes a whole bunch of records, key value pairs, and they can all happen in parallel, right? A whole bunch of intermediate key value pairs get generated, and that is one of the reasons why it's such a nice model to build, tune, and optimize. There's massive parallelism because of the memorylessness. You typically think of a single record as a few hundred or few kilobytes at best, and that works very nicely. In the shuffle stage, all the intermediate key value pairs are looked at, and they're grouped by the key. And once the grouping is done, they get passed to the reducer, which is, again, another memoryless function. It takes a single key together with all its values. I put a star there because in practice, it's often convenient to assume that it gets hold of all the values in some particular pre-specified order. And in fact, often a reducer is implementing a one pass or a data stream style algorithm over all the values for that one key. Because in some cases, the number of values for a single key could be so large that it might be hard to load it in memory, and things get a bit bit complicated. But again, the point here is that the reducer is also a memoryless function which deals with one key and all its values together, and it produces 0 or more output values for that key. So which, again, this memorylessness property makes it very easy to run a lot of these reducers in parallel. And effectively what's happening is a whole orchestra of mappers and reducers are running together with these shufflers grouping and passing things around. So this is, because of the simplicity of the model, it's very easy to write code in this model, and it's very, very natural to optimize the performance of a system here. So it's a great fit for lots of simple data processing tasks. I put simple in quotes because typically the nature of the computation here is very simple. For example, one of the original motivations was building an inverted index at Google. You have a lot of documents. Each document has a lot of terms. Think of a document coming with the key is the document ID, and the terms are all the values for the document. And what you want to build from there is an inverted index, which is given a term, you want to collect a list of all the documents that contain it. And that's a very easy, straightforward MapReduce computation. And that was, in fact, one of the motivating examples of this. The one thing about MapReduce is that the I/O complexity is rather large because of all the intermediate values that get generated and regrouped and rewritten as files, which means that we really should think of each pass of MapReduce. If you want to solve a more complicated problem by a sequence of MapReduces, you have to assume that the pass complexity is fairly large. The pass complexity or the round complexity is important because the I/O usually slows things down, and if you want to run a MapReduce with 100 or 200 passes, almost surely something's going to go wrong and some machine's going to come down, and it is not considered a good thing to write a MapReduce with square root of n passes for an n size input. Okay. Despite this, of course, there was a very nice large-scale machine learning platform at Google that was built based on multipass MapReduce. There is a talk by Tushar Chandra, who's a distributed systems expert at this year's Wisdom Conference. It's worth looking at just to understand what kind of issues underlie large data set computations in a really large real-world application. The reason I bring this up here is that the model is simple, model is nice, the pass complexity is large, but to build something very general purpose based on a model like this still took a lot of work. It took about 5-6 years of work before this machine learning system could be widely applicable. So our assumptions about models often leave a large gap between theory and practice, and I'll come back to this a little later. Turning to more theoretical side of things, there's a whole bunch of clever algorithms that people have designed for graph and optimization problems in MapReduce. Typically, log or polylog many passes of MapReduce algorithms. Some examples are minimum spanning tree, matching, greedy algorithms, dense subgraphs, and so on. I'll talk about one of the paradigms called the filtering paradigm a little later, but that's actually a nice one to remember. What the filtering paradigm does is it brings a nice combination of MapReduce together with simple standard sequential computation, interleaving them nicely to produce some good results. I'll mention that a little bit later. So to sum up why MapReduce has left it in a slightly unsatisfactory state of affairs, the large I/O complexity meant that multiple passes and multiple iterations take time, and there is something called the patience threshold, which is you have some idea, you want to build something and put it into an experiment and see how it does. Typically takes you want it to take a few hours, not a few days, right? If something didn't go right, you're resetting the clock and starting all over again. And the pass complexity is often a hindrance in getting things done much faster. And again, the second point is somewhat orthogonal to this, and that is the software ecosystem matters more. And this is the point I made earlier about the machine learning system. Building the software ecosystem around that turned out to be as important as the quality of the algorithm itself. On the lower bound side, MapReduce is a big roadblock for us because with the right number of passes, it's as powerful as the complexity class NC. So there's not much we can really hope to prove in terms of pass lower bounds or the size of the intermediate output or any of these things. So,
what is a pass?
A pass is you start with start with an input, you write a MapReduce computation. In other words, you write a mapper and reducer, you run them together, you get a new set of new output, and then you repeat the same algorithm on this. A typical multi-pass MapReduce algorithm does this over and over again until the desired output is produced. Think of it as rounds if you like. Okay, so here's what I want to tell you about in the rest of the talk. So let's make a few comments about how in many real problems there are two parameters. Think of the graph with number of vertices and edges. It's really a bit of a generalization of that. I want to highlight two theoretical models that seem to be heading in the right direction, but they still leave some parameters that need to be understood better. One is the semi-streaming model. The other one is the filtering MapReduce algorithms that I alluded to earlier. I also want to introduce two models that practitioners are very fond of these days, the parameter server and the mill wheel type model. Again, I'll mention what they are. And I want to highlight connected components as a simple problem where I think there is a fundamental gap in our understanding, and I think it's worth understanding it, either in terms of a better upper bound or in terms of a good lower bound. Okay. I already mentioned this is like saying that in a real problem, real graph, you have two parameters, n and m. And it seems to matter that one is much smaller than the other one, and it seems like n is something small that we can deal with. But very often, even there, assuming that there is n words of main memory is often not accurate. You might need to split it into multiple machines if you want to do it in a random access memory. The parameter m often is very large. Think of it as the number of edges in a graph, and there we are forced to partition the input into multiple files in disk. And the notion of streaming, as we talk about in the theory world, is completely impractical. There's also the issue of density or the degree of the instances. Think of it as the number of variables that show up in a typical constraint in a linear programming problem. Okay. So semi-streaming. This was introduced by Muthukrishnan in about 2003, and some of the nicest papers here came from the work of Feigenbaum, Sampath Kannan, Andrew McGregor, Sid Suri, and Jian Zheng. That's in 2004. And more recently, An and Guha have been writing a bunch of interesting papers in this area as well on graph and LP algorithms. So here the idea is very simple. So the idea that Muthukrishnan proposed is that you get to do a single pass on the input, except that now, instead of the traditional polylog memory, you assume that you have n times polylog memory. If you think about a graph problem, the assumption is that you can hold information, a few bytes of information per vertex, but you cannot afford to hold a few bytes of information per edge. Right? You get a streaming pass over the edges, but you can hold a non-trivial amount of information on a per vertex basis. One or a few passes over the data is okay. So this is the model, and I'll tell you why this is actually a nice model in a few minutes. But Feigenbaum et al. Gave some graph algorithms in this model. Quite a few interesting problems they solved. More recently, Guha and An gave some LP algorithms, I think specifically packing and covering problems in this model, and also maximum weighted matching, I think. There's a very rare lower bound here in a paper of Ashish Goel, Michael Kapralov, and Sanjeev Khanna that appeared 3 years ago in SODA. And this lower bound is actually a very interesting one if you think about it. This is a communication lower bound. So you have Alice and Bob, each have parts of a subset of the edges of an input graph. And what they showed was if you wanted to approximate the size of the maximum bipartite matching in this graph to a factor that's better than 2/3, you need strictly superlinear in n communication. So this I think roughly gets to the heart of the story, right? Because on the one hand, this is quite far from saying it's not stated in terms of the number of edges. It's still in terms of number of vertices. The reason this is interesting is if you think about a standard semi-streaming model of computation, there are certain problems that become very, very easy. For example, I'll mention this a bit later too. Graph connectivity becomes very easy in this model, right? You can maintain a union find tree in n log n size memory, and you can do it in a single pass. That works pretty well. Whereas here, on the one hand, you don't need to transfer the entire graph. I think they, in fact, get some algorithms too in this paper, but I'm not totally sure. But something like n amount of memory or n polylog n amount of memory is not going to work if you want to do it in this one-round communication model. So that is actually a rare and surprising lower bound in this world. The other algorithmic paradigm that has emerged, one of the nicer ones is this one called MapReduce filters, or the notion of interleaving standard sequential computations with MapReduce passes. And this is due to Silvio Lattanzi, Ben Moseley, Sid Suri, and Sergei Vasilevsky. Here, it's a bit important to pay attention to the parameters here. There are n vertices in a graph and n to the 1 plus c edges. Think of c as a half. So you have about n times square root of n many edges in this graph. And you have a non-trivial number of machines. Think of it as n to the 0.1 or n to the 1/4 number of machines. And each one has, again, a non-trivial amount of memory. You have more than order n memory here. Assume that there's a gap between c and epsilon here, right? So what they do in this model is, again, I'll tell you the result first, and then we can go back here. They produce algorithms where you have so many machines with this kind of parameters, and the algorithms run in C over epsilon many rounds. It's an iterative algorithm where typically what you do is you do some basic computation that MapReduce pass over the data, or MapReduce, or any of these simple kind of parallelization primitives. And once you do that, you do some computation in memory, and then you try to put things together. So again, if the problem size is small, they say, okay, let's go solve it on a single machine. If not, they're going to partition the edges among machines, and that's something that's very easy to do in a single MapReduce pass. You assign some random number to every edge, and you distribute them according to the random number. And then the key notion here is filtering out edges that you think are not needed. So once the data gets partitioned among machines, each machine does a local computation. Again, think of a minimum spanning tree. Each machine gets a bunch of the edges. It looks at its edges, computes an MST on what it has, and whatever edge it doesn't need for the MST, it throws away. Now the remaining graph is really the union of all these minimum spanning trees. Right now that you get a significant data reduction there, and you iterate until the data becomes small enough that you can fit in memory. Okay? So that paradigm works nicely for minimum spanning tree, works for maximal matchings, it works for connected components, and by reducing approximate maximum weight matching to maximal matchings, they also produce algorithms for maximum weighted matching in this model. Okay. So these are fairly simple, fairly nice algorithms. And in settings like this, where your machines have a non-trivial amount of memory and you have a non-trivial number of them, you get significant speedups. Okay, so that's part 2. Part 3, I want to mention a couple of things about what practitioners do, and I want to tie it all back together with connected components in a couple of minutes. Okay. In practice, there are 2 models that I wanted to bring to your attention. One is this thing called a parameter server. Here, think of again the dichotomy between n and m here. If n is the number of parameters you want to maintain, again, a few kilobytes per vertex is okay. That's something that we can afford, and this is managed by a distributed hash table that is spread across multiple machines. So even for large values of n, you can actually do things fine. One of the most common use cases of this is in machine learning, where you have a bunch of parameters that you're optimizing over, a bunch of variables that you're optimizing over. Or think of a neural network. Every weight in the neural network is a parameter. So you have a whole bunch of them. The most recent neural networks often have several millions of these edges, several hundreds of millions of these edges. So that gets split among multiple machines. And it's a very common, it's becoming increasingly popular in the machine learning community, both in the Google Brain deep machine learning style algorithms, also in other kinds of machine learning systems that people have built. So in the machine learning setting, what happens is typically there's a bunch of parameters that you're optimizing over, and you want to make sure that you find a solution that's optimal or nearly optimal, and it's a function of these things. And the input training data gets split across machines. Every machine processes a whole bunch of training examples. It's operating on its own noisy copy of the global parameter set, right? Every now and then the machine talks to the parameter server and says, give me the most recent copy of the parameters. Let me go and update the parameters locally. Typically what you do is you run the model, your neural network on some training data. If it makes a mistake, you say, let me change the parameters so that I get a little bit better performance on the training data that I look at. And after a while, the machine communicates its updates to the parameter server. So at any point, every machine has some noisy copy of the global information, and they synchronize periodically. So that's, and all the system optimizes for all the nice things like checkpointing, parameters, and all the nice things. Fault tolerance and distributions and everything else is hidden from the user. So if you're programming a machine learning model, you're actually pretending as if you get to deal with the entire parameter space and you're doing things nicely. For many machine learning problems, there's also some nice convergence type results, at least in some theoretical sense. So it works quite well for them. I'm going to skip the comment about the multiplicative updates. So the other model I want to mention is this thing called Millwheel. Again, you can go look it up. It's fairly straightforward. These are two systems papers and systems work. Here the assumption is that you do a lot of message passing, and we think of information as split among lots of machines, and each machine manages a bunch of information. And the key idea here is that there is a key value pair, and every machine is responsible for a bunch of keys. And instead of thinking monolithically as order n global memory, we think of each key as getting order 1 words of memory, and lots of messages get exchanged, and computations happen when one machine decides to send a note to another machine about updating some information. Again, the systems take care of all kinds of nice things here. Okay, so I'll just say a few things about connected components and come to my punchline in the next slide. Connected components is a problem that we all know and love, and we think it's easy from many different viewpoints. As I mentioned, the filtering algorithms work really well here. Small number of rounds in the model where machines have a lot of memory and you have a good number of machines. There's also a very nice MapReduce friendly algorithm available for this. This is actually a very simple algorithm that says, again, I'll skip the details. So that works nicely in log squared and rounds. And there's also a nice semi-streaming algorithm. The union find algorithm works in a single pass, log n work per edge, n log n amount of memory. But the big problem with all of these is that the total amount of bits communicated is omega m. And that is one of the biggest reasons why these kind of, despite all these nice things, that is too much communication in practice. Right? We said that omega m is a lot of memory to keep, but it also becomes the bottleneck when you want to run MapReduce style computations for this. So that takes me to my final slide, which is really this, which is the message I wanted to leave you with. Pick your favorite problem. Think of connected components, for example. And I want to propose this as a model of what constitutes a scalable computation. So you have a large number of machines, and that's important that the scaling happens at a large number of machines, not for 2, 3, 4, or a constant number of machines. Allow yourself polylog in n many rounds, significant amount of memory per machine, n polylog n. And what we want obviously is scaling. So we want m over k times polylog time per machine. So that's the point of throwing in a lot of machines here. But the key point I want to bring about is that the total amount of data that gets transferred, either in the message passing sense or, again, here you don't think of Blackboard or message sense if you're not doing lower bounds. For upper bounds, either in terms of the data written to disk or data communicated between machines, we want to reduce the total data transfer to n log n or n polylog n as opposed to having a dependence on m, the bigger parameter here. Or prove that it cannot be done, right? Pick your favorite k-player communication model. We might as well drop the time and memory requirements because they usually play no role in communication lower bounds. So can we show that for large k, we have a lower bound. Lower bound that is strictly faster growing than n polylog n. So I think doing something like this, either in upper bounds or lower bounds. If you get a great upper bound, wonderful. Go to the next problem. Pick a harder problem like matching or something. Or if not, the point where we prove a first lower bound here will be, I consider a breakthrough. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So are there any questions?
Is there any place in Google where somebody is using linear sketches?
That's linear sketches meaning? The kind of AMS kind of sketches? Yes. Or? I'm pretty sure that's the case, yeah. Yeah, sketches are indeed useful and linear nearest neighbor type stuff. There are libraries and things that have been built, yeah. There's also a nice paper in Stock 2002 by Moses Charikar that also introduces some kind of sketching. those are inspired by the MaxCut algorithm. So it's not a linear sketch really, but yeah, that kind of sketching is also quite commonly used.
When you say this memory time per machine, for example, that's the expected value. Do you know anything about the distribution of that? Probably.
So you comment about MapReduce. I thought what adds to the complexity of analyzing the system is because multiple people are running multiple tasks, right? And so maybe in an amortized sense, the interaction between all these things works quite well, and so the system does do all the things that you want it to do, because maybe you're stressing one part of the system whereas another thing is stressing another part of the system. So is there any value to analyzing even individual problems?
I see. This question is the value of MapReduce. One of the reasons it's valuable is because there's lots of people running lots of computations, and it deals with the ensemble of all the computations very well. And that is certainly true from a systems perspective. So you're asking the question, why even bother analyzing a single algorithm in the MapReduce model? I think our notion of what is efficient keeps getting refined, right? My reason at least is that streaming algorithms are not practical in the sense that we think about them, right? So on the other hand, MapReduce is something that people can go and write code for, and people do write code for that. So.
Okay, so let's thank the speaker again.